When the American frontier was pushing westward back in the 1800s, what we now call the Old West was born. It wasn't just saloon shootouts. It was tough land, weak law, and a whole lot of strange stories. There was a doctor who ordered boots and a bag made from the skin of a famous outlaw, and a thief who left verses inside the safes he cracked. It's this lesser-told side, half real, half legend, that we're going to explore in 25 remarkable cases. Number 1. At the end of the Old West, a thief named George Big Nose Parrot met his fate in a way that still gives people chills. After he was lynched in 1881, instead of going straight to the cemetery, his body ended up on the table of Dr. John Eugene Osborne in Wyoming, a man who later became governor. Osborne had the outlaw's back skin removed and ordered a pair of boots and a small bag. Years later, he showed up to his inauguration wearing those very boots, as if he were deliberately stepping on the outlaw's memory. Parrot's skull was sawed in half and turned into an office piece for Lillian Heath, the first female doctor in the state, who used the bone as an ashtray and a desk weight. On top of that, Osborne tried to study the outlaw's brain, thinking he might find some clue to explain what makes a man cross the line and embrace a life of crime. Number 2. John Wesley Harden grew up in the gunpowder trail of the Old West and bragged about sending dozens of men to the cemetery. After more than 20 years behind bars, he ended up on the floor of a saloon in El Paso in 1895, shot in the back by fellow gunman John Selman. Years earlier, in 1871 in Abilene, Kansas, after a night of cards and heavy drinking, Harden stayed in a room next to farmer Charles Cougar. Annoyed by his neighbor's snoring, he pulled out his revolver and fired through the wall. Cougar died without even knowing what had happened. Years later, Harden still joked that he had only killed a man for snoring. Number 3. In Fort Griffin, deep in the heart of Texas, a cluster of tents and saloons became a mandatory stop for anyone living on the edge of the law. At the crossroads of the cattle trails and the Brazos River, exhausted cowboys, buffalo hunters, professional gamblers, and outlaws all mixed together late into the night. Men like the quick-draw John Wesley Harden drank and gambled there, as did the dentist-turned-gambler Doc Holliday, usually in the company of Kate, the famous Big Nose. People said that if you stuck around long enough, you'd see everything. Duels over card debts, fights over stolen horses, and even sheriffs looking the other way, as long as the poker tables stayed full. No wonder folks nicknamed the place the Babylon of the Brazos, a perfect symbol of the price paid for the so-called American frontier. Number 4. In the Old West, Black Bart became a legend not for violence, but for the unusual way he operated. Born Charles Bowles, an Englishman, he crossed the Atlantic as a young man and ended up chasing the gold rush in 1849. When the dream of striking it rich never came true, he set his sights on something else: Wells Fargo stagecoaches that carried money and mail across the American West. Wearing a neat hat and speaking politely, he robbed without yelling or firing shots, and he even left poems behind as his signature, something unthinkable for a typical outlaw. He was tied to dozens of robberies, was arrested later in life, and after he was released, he quietly disappeared, closing his story as a strange mix between criminal and tavern tale folk character. Number 5. At the height of the American frontier, drinking whiskey was almost a show of toughness. Traders would impress native people and cowboys with their fire water by tossing a shot straight into the flames, making the fire flare up even higher. It wasn't fine liquor. It was made with extremely strong alcohol, burnt molasses, tobacco, and whatever else they had on hand. It was cheap, harsh, and hit like a punch to the gut. One shot could knock down a big man, and plenty of saloon fights started after a few glasses of that poison, traded for furs, gold, or the last of a man's wages when loneliness and cold spoke louder. No wonder it became the most feared drink in that Wild West. Number 6. Elmer J. McCurdy was a train robber best known for his bungled heists. In 1911, after a botched robbery in Oklahoma, he died in a shootout with the police. With no family around, funeral director Joseph L. Johnson preserved the body, dressed Elmer up like an outlaw, and started charging coins from curious visitors. Years later, two men claimed to be his brothers, took the coffin, and vanished. They were actually owners of a traveling show and put the corpse on the road as an attraction. McCurdy became a sideshow piece in carnivals, crime museums, and cheap movies, until he ended up hanging in a haunted house ride in California. In 1976, a TV crew realized the dummy was a real human body. In 1977, more than 60 years after his death, Elmer finally got a grave in Oklahoma covered in concrete so no one could steal him again. Number 7. In the Old West, people talk a lot about Jesse James, but the cold mind behind the duo was his older brother Frank. From a young age, they left ordinary life behind and formed the James Younger Gang, robbing trains and banks across several states, always leaving fear and bodies in their wake. After Jesse was killed in 1882 by one of his own partners, Frank realized the game was over. He went to the governor of Missouri and turned himself in, saying he had spent his whole life on horseback without a single day of peace. Tried twice, he walked free, and as a worn-out older man, he became a tour guide, a farmer, and even a circus assistant until he died in 1915. Until the end, many people saw him more as a legend than a former outlaw. Number 8. James Killer. Miller, known as Deacon Jim, became a legend in the Old West not just for the number of men he killed, but for how cold-blooded he was. In official records, they credit him with around 14 deaths. In bar talk, people said 40 or 50. Many believe he was the one who killed Pat Garrett, the sheriff famous for hunting down and killing Billy the Kid, someone seen as both a hero and a nightmare at the time. The strange part is that Miller claimed to be a man of faith. He didn't drink, didn't smoke, and was always in the Methodist Church, helping with services like a model believer. At the same time, he took money for hired killings and wore a steel plate under his clothes that had already saved him from shots to the chest. This mix of devotion and violence eventually annoyed even the people who protected him. In 1909, a group decided to take justice into their own hands and hanged Miller, ending once and for all the career of the so-called Killer Deacon. Number 9. In 1870, on a lonely stretch between Elizabethtown and Taos, a traveler decided to spend the night at a small roadside stop. The place was run by Charles Kennedy, a big, bearded man who hardly looked anyone in the eye, and his wife, Rose, who was Ute. The couple had a young son. When the boy saw the stranger, he said bluntly that his father killed people on the road. Not long after, gunshots broke the desert silence. The traveler fell dead, and the boy himself was silenced forever. Years later, locals said the ground around the cabin hid the bones of dozens of men who only wanted to cross the Old West but never reached their destination or sent word back home. Number 10. In the early 1870s, on a lonely little road in Kansas, the Bender family ran a small inn for wagon-weary travelers. It seemed like a peaceful place, a hot meal, a simple bed, and quiet conversation. Little by little, though, people who passed through started disappearing without a trace. Suspicious neighbors organized a search and went inside the house. Behind a curtain, they found a trap door leading to a basement stained with dried blood. Bodies were discovered buried nearby, showing clear signs of ambush. The Benders had already run off, and to this day no one knows for sure what happened to them. Only that their name became a byword for terror in the Old West and still comes up in conversations as a reminder that not every welcoming home is what it seems. Number 11. Back in the Old West, any smart card player avoided sitting with his back to the door. The rule was simple: lean against the wall, keep an eye on whoever walked in, and keep your hand close to the holster. Every man knew a saloon fight could start over nothing. Even so, in 1876, in Deadwood, South Dakota, James Butler Wild Bill Hickok ended up letting his guard down at Nuttall and Mann's saloon. He sat wherever he could, facing the game, his back exposed. Jack McCall quietly came up behind him, pulled his revolver, and shot Hickok in the head. On the table were the cards that later became known as the dead man's hand, a reminder that one wrong move there could cost you your life. Number 12. Mary Catherine Haroni, later known as Big Nose Kate, started life surrounded by luxury in Europe. But as a young girl, she lost her parents and ended up drifting from family to family until she eventually headed out west on her own. Widowed and broke, she wound up in the saloons of Texas, dancing and keeping company with cowboys and gamblers. That's where she crossed paths with Doc Holliday, the tubercular dentist who became a gunslinger and Wyatt Earp's partner. More than his lover, Kate became his accomplice. One night, to get Doc out of jail, she set fire to a storage building, caused chaos in the town, and helped him escape before he could get hit with a long sentence. Years later, she would remember that night saying that without her, Doc's name might have died right there behind bars. Number 13. In the American West, the neckerchief was just as important as the hat or the revolver. Cowboys, stagecoach drivers, and even sheriffs wore big cotton bandanas, usually red or patterned. In everyday life, they were used to filter dust on the trails, wipe sweat, improvise a bandage, or grab a hot pan at mealtime. On long rides, they protected the neck from the harsh sun, and at night they took a bit of the chill away. But the same bandana also came into play when the law was tossed aside. All it took was pulling it up over the nose to hide a face during a bank robbery or a quick score. In that way, this simple piece of cloth helped the common man handle both the hard work and the constant dangers of the frontier, and it became a trademark of everything we imagine today when we think of the Old West. Number 14. Born in England in 1851, Alice Ivers came to the United States young and grew up in a country pushing westward. In her youth, she traded boarding school for the mining towns of Colorado, where gold, drinking, and gambling went hand in hand. After her husband died in a mining accident, she started living off what she earned at the tables, first as a player and later as a dealer in Creed, at a saloon owned by Bob Ford, the man known for killing Jesse James. With a calm face and a .38 in her purse, she could tally cards in her head and knew how to get a man to let his guard down. They said she once took home $6,000 in a single night, enough money to buy land, cattle, and still have some left over. Years later, already the owner of a small resort near Sturgis, South Dakota, she faced off against a group of drunken soldiers who attacked the place. She fired in self-defense, killed one of them, and became national news. She was acquitted for the killing, but the law kept an eye on her because of the gambling, the drinking, and the business she ran. Number 15. Pearl Hart was born in Canada, and while still young, saw a Buffalo Bill show that sparked in her the idea of dropping everything and heading west. In her 20s, she hit the road toward Arizona, trying her luck like so many people of that time. There she got involved with a man named Joe Boot, and in 1899 the two decided to rob a stagecoach, something that until then was considered a man's job. The robbery only worked for a few hours. They took a wrong turn, got lost in the desert, and ended up arrested. Pearl became a newspaper headline, treated as both a curiosity and a threat. Convicted, she spent little time in jail, partly because there was almost no structure to hold a woman in a system built entirely for men. Number 16. In 1860, long before phones or email, American entrepreneurs created the Pony Express to force the country closer together. The idea was to connect St. Joseph, Missouri to Sacramento, California in about 10 days, using lightweight saddles, skinny teenage riders, and horses swapped out roughly every 20 kilometers. The route crossed snow, desert heat, swollen rivers, and areas in conflict with indigenous groups. Each rider traveled for hours in the dark, pistol at his hip and a leather pouch carrying government mail, business letters, and news from back east. The service only lasted from 1860 to 1861, burning through money fast, but it proved that mail could move at real speed. When the telegraph finally stretched across the continent, the Pony Express became a museum piece almost overnight, leaving behind one of the great myths of the Old West. To this day, many people see it as a symbol of a generation that did everything by sheer grit and accepted danger as part of the job. Number 17. In the mid-1850s, the United States Army decided to test an idea that today sounds like bar talk, using camels to cross the West. Inspired by how these animals were used in North Africa and the Middle East, some officers convinced Congress to fund the experiment. In 1856, about 70 camels arrived in Texas and were taken to Camp Verde, where they began test marches carrying heavy loads across dry, rocky terrain. Reports said they could carry more weight than mules and needed less water, which impressed a lot of people at the time. The project, however, never really took off. Soldiers hated the smell, thought the animals were stubborn, and the horses panicked just from seeing them. After the Civil War, interest faded. The Army shut down the experiment, and the camels were sold off or simply left behind in the desert, turning into one of those forgotten curiosities of the Old West. Number 18. Behind the idea of taking a scalp, there's a more complicated history than most people realize. Long before the Civil War, different native peoples in North America already used this act as public proof that someone had defeated an enemy. Later, European settlers and local governments began paying bounties for scalps, turning killing into a business. During the conflict between North and South, figures like the Confederate guerrilla William Bloody Bill Anderson pushed this practice to a level of calculated terror, using it to spread fear wherever they went and to show there were no limits to how they waged war. Number 19. In the past, St. Elmo's fire appeared on stormy nights as a bluish glow on the tips of ship masts. Many sailors swore it was divine protection before facing rough seas. Years later, during the great cattle drives of the West, the same glow sometimes showed up on the cattle's horns or in the horses' manes. Imagine being on night watch at the ranch, seeing the whole herd glowing in the dark, with no way to explain it. For many seasoned cowboys, it felt like a serious warning that something big was coming. Today, science calls it electricity in the air, but back then, it was pure mystery. Number 20. When we think of the Old West, what usually comes to mind is a movie with a white gunslinger and a sheriff with a star on his chest. But looking at the records from the time, the reality was very different. It's estimated that 1 out of every 4 cowboys was black. These men drove herds, broke wild horses, fixed whatever was falling apart, and still faced long trips taking cattle to market. During the Civil War, many landowners went off to fight and left their ranches in the hands of enslaved people, who ended up running everything on their own. After abolition, some of these men saw cowboy work as a real chance to earn their own money, travel freely, and no longer have a boss controlling every step they took. Even so, they almost disappeared from the stories told in books and Hollywood, and only in recent decades have researchers started putting their names back on the map of the West. Number 21. In the Old West, a bounty hunter only got paid if he showed up in town with the outlaw dead, thrown over a saddle or hauled in on a wagon. It was hard, slow, and smelly work, but it was the only way to prove the man had been found. When cameras started appearing in small towns, everything changed. The hunter took the body to the local studio, the dead man was propped up against a wall, and the click of the shutter became the receipt. After that, all the hunter had to do was show the picture to the sheriff to collect the reward, without having to spend days on the trail hauling a corpse, making the job just a little less risky. Number 22. In the days of the Old West, the saloon was where everything happened: gambling, drinking, business, and plenty of trouble. Road-weary cowboys, dust-covered miners, and gunmen looking for a fight crowded around the bar while someone kept an eye on the door with a hand close to the holster. Far from the neat image in the movies, many saloons were rough wooden shacks thrown together in a hurry, always at risk of fires and brawls. The famous Long Branch Saloon in Dodge City, Kansas, became a symbol of that world. The original building burned down, but its reputation still feeds the legend of the Old West. Deals for cattle and debt settlements were also made there, almost always backed by bluffing. Number 23. Tatanka Iotanka, known to white settlers as Sitting Bull, was born on the plains of what is now South Dakota and grew up watching the buffalo disappear and barbed wire move in. A feared warrior, he also became a kind of Lakota head of state, trying to negotiate treaties while knowing that in practice, their lands were being taken piece by piece. Before the famous Battle of Little Bighorn, he said he had visions of soldiers falling like grasshoppers, which only boosted his reputation. Years later, tired of running, he agreed to surrender and live on the reservation. There he accepted an offer to travel with Buffalo Bill's show, riding in front of crowds who saw him as an exotic attraction. He earned good money in dollars but spent it helping anyone in need, and eventually returned home, never feeling like he truly belonged to the country growing up around him. Number 24. In the 19th century American West, women were a rare sight. In many mining or cattle towns, you could count them on your fingers. Sometimes there were dozens of men for every one woman. When saloons and gambling halls opened, owners quickly brought in singers, dancers, and company girls to keep customers at the bar and keep the money flowing through whiskey and beer. Some also got involved in prostitution, others didn't. But almost all of them walked a thin line between opportunity and danger, trying to save a little money and hold on to some respect in a world built by and for armed men. A lot of people today forget that without them, many towns wouldn't have gotten off the ground at all. Number 25. Geronimo, a Chiricahua Apache warrior, grew up in a time when the map of the Southwest kept changing, first Mexico, then the United States. When Mexican soldiers killed his family, he swore revenge and spent decades attacking outposts, ranches, and railroad lines, using the desert as his ally. To many Americans of the time, he was the terror of the frontier. To his own people, he was the last shield against losing their land completely. In 1886, surrounded by troops and tracked without rest, he finally surrendered and spent the rest of his life as a prisoner of war. As an older man, he accepted Christian baptism and started earning some money at fairs and shows, selling souvenirs with his signature. His story shows the real cost of that Old West we tend to see only as an adventure, not as a legend without consequences.